yeah, at the time, people were like, no, intelligence messed up. The stigma in federal government in D.C., maybe, outside of D.C., I can't say for sure, was that because, you missed 9/11 and there was bad intel leading up to the Iraq War, we have this whole apparatus that we pay billions of dollars for. What's it doing to keep me safe as an American? There's that whole old adage that, intelligence, you never know when it's successful, you only see when it fails. But there are two major failures, pretty in close succession. Maybe it was an existential threat to, what is the point of intel? Are we in a new age where this whole apparatus was built around the Cold War and a very specific nation-state enemy that we're unable to respond to with different threats?
Teresa Smetzer, CEO of Smetzer Associates and retired CIA executive. So I started my own company, Jasmine Consulting, and the entire concept was helping understanding mission problems, how to find the best of breed technology, data, processes to bring them in, and lo and behold, there was a lot of market for it. My first contract happened to be the White House Weapons of Mass Destruction. Because I'd worked Iraq CW, I was on the commission. Remember, that was the other shoe of the 9/11 tragedy, which was we fundamentally got the Iraq CW question wrong. And so the White House had the WMD commission, the Hill had the 9/11 commission, they had the power of the pen and the purse. So they created the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Protection Act, which led to the DNI. So for me, rolling off of the White House Commission, which was by far one of the most stressful and fascinating things I've ever done in my career, the DNI very early on reached out to me about contracting to come in to help them. So for me, it was an obvious imperative. Just, having seen the 74 recommendations that came out of the White House Commission, understanding that it wasn't really politicized or distorted. It was just flat wrong. So the power, the meaning of analytic integrity and standards across this enterprise, why it was so uneven and why that was such a problem. All the other things that became the DNI and analytic transformation, to me, were obvious. The other thing is, based on some of the programs I had run or been involved in, I knew there was going to be a window of time where we could get things done before it became sort of, for lack of a better word, calcified, like the IC staff had when I first started, and then the community management staff, where the DCI was was both the head of the CIA as well as the head of the community. This was like the next iteration with more purpose. And so for me, it was a no-brainer. I had to go.
Mark Lowenthal, former Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Analysis and Production. When the 9/11 Commission was being set up in, I guess it was 2003, Philip Zelikow was named as the staff director on a Tuesday. On Thursday, he came out to the CIA building to talk about the investigation and what was going to happen. And one of the reasons George asked me to come back was I knew a lot about congressional investigations of national security. I'm probably the only person left alive on the earth who's read all 9 investigations of Pearl Harbor, which I read for my dissertation. So it was me, Zelikow, me. Winston Wiley was the Assistant Director for Homeland Security. Winston's deputy, Joe Augustine, is in the room. And we all know each other, and we have chit-chat. Then we sit down, and Zelikow goes, "This is simple. If you guys had had a national intelligence director, none of this would have happened." And I'm thinking, whoa, he's been in the job for 72 hours, and he already has an answer. This is sort of like the Red Queen. First the verdict, then the trial. Now, I actually know Zelikow, and I realized, all right, there's no time to push back. He can get very edgy. My director doesn't need this. Just listen politely. So the meeting was over, and later in the afternoon, I got called into George's office and said, how'd that meeting go? I said, piece of cake. The attendant looks at me and says, piece of cake? I said, yeah. He says, what meeting are you talking about? I said, I'm talking about Zelikow. What are you talking about? He said, I'm talking about Zelikow. I said, what are you talking about? I played the meeting out. I replayed the meeting for George. And he looked at me and said, George, this is one of the reasons you brought me back. I'm the only one who knows all this crap. I said, when Philip was on the Bush 41 NSC, he wanted to create a DNI, and he couldn't figure out how to do it. He's figured it out, George. This whole investigation is going to be about us. And when we get through to the other end, we're going to have a DNI. And George said, I can't deal with this crap. Get out of my office. I can't deal with this now. And that's what happened. And most of the investigations of the 9/11 commissions about the CIA was, if I spend time on the FBI, why do I got to get a better FBI? And so the DNI, I was not surprised when they came out recommending a DNI. I mean, it was Philip's ingoing proposition.
Nobody wanted this.
Teresa, again.
There was so much angst over, particularly in the analytic community, the negative sort of press that analysts were getting for missing both the Iraq WMD as well as 9/11. Policymakers were skeptical of, realizing the level of what had happened on both things. They were now skeptical of intelligence. So there was a lot of it was way more than they weren't happy with it. Nobody wanted it.
I am John Keefe, and I was the Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analytic Mission Management. When the Office of the DNI first stood up, first there was controversy about it. Not everybody in the community or in Congress were on board with the idea, and for that matter in the White House, although I think that ultimately President Bush came out in favor of it. I know the NSC staff at the time came out in favor of the creation of an ODNI. I think the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, was nervous about it because they were not clear on the implications for combat support agencies. And then there was, not surprisingly, there's a little bit of lack of clarity in the legislation about where did CIA fit now, and CIA I can say this with benefit of my time at the NSC, CIA needs a close relationship with the White House and the NSC in particular because of some of the activities that they're asked to do, and then sometimes some of their sources, NSA is sometimes in this category where the sources are so sensitive that the distribution is not going to be the normal distribution. Even in the intel community, it's going to be really restricted down to a handful of people. So I think there were ambiguities in the legislation, and then there were agencies that thought maybe the DNI is not really in charge. What can the DNI tell me to do? And I don't think that came from agency directors, but it certainly came from agency officers and other agencies.
Now we hear again from Dr. Lowenthal.
I testified later against the idea of the DNI, and I'll tell you why. When I was on the staff director of the House Intelligence Committee, we were doing a project called IC-21, the Intelligence Community of the 21st Century. And I got to interview some former DCIs, including Richard Helms, which was just fascinating. And Helms took an interest in our project. He was very, and he said to me he used to have lunch in the Mayflower Hotel. He was sitting in the very far corner of the dining room so you could have the whole room under surveillance. It was very interesting. He always had this little banquette in the corner. And he said, he was talking about this idea of a national intelligence director. This is back in 95. And he said, when you're sitting in that small room in the White House, meaning the sit room, everybody around that table has stuff. The SecDef, all he is stuff. He's Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. The Attorney General's got the FBI, the Secretary of State's got embassies. I'm the head of U.S. intelligence. If I don't own analysts and operators, I'm like the Pope of intelligence. Take intelligence, it's good for you. That I have to own assets to have any meaning at the table. And I thought this was really a compelling point that Director Helms made. And so I felt that the DNI was flying in the face of that, because the DNI was going to be there in this position, but the operators and the analysts were still going to be controlled essentially by the new head of the CIA, there are analysts elsewhere. The DI has analysts and elsewhere, but the bulk of that, and Helms also said, the two most dangerous things we do are espionage and covert action. That's still in the CIA. And so what was this person going to do? And how is this person going to do it? He doesn't have a lot of budget authority because SecDef pushed back against that. And so what was this person going to be able to accomplish? And I just felt it was a very bad idea.
John Keefe again.
But I am aware of at least one individual when he retired from a different agency, not ODNI. When he retired, said the job number one was to undermine the Office of the DNI. So when you're in the community, you get to be aware of what people's views are, and so that this was not a particular surprise, but I was surprised that somebody would actually say it so explicitly.
Don Burke, Intellipedia Doyen. There was a predecessor to the DNI, and that existed inside. It essentially was headquartered inside CIA. So
what was that called?
Community management office. I can't remember the exact.
Community management staff.
Yeah, I think that's something like that. And it served, it was the earlier nucleus of what became the DNI. Most of that staff became part of DNI. So it's not like it actually was that dramatically different for us. Maybe for the rest of the community it was. I can't speak to them, but that sort of seemed kind of natural. But for us it was really helpful because the early directors all really were focused on this idea of connecting the dots, right? Because that's what we got hammered for on 9/11 was missing the dots. That the information was there, we just didn't connect the dots.
Now we hear again from Teresa Smetzer.
Tom Finger makes the point that there were a handful of senior analytic managers who recognized this was an opportunity to do stuff that needed to happen and that politically they just couldn't do. And so that group really was very supportive, assuming that we were able to get done some of the stuff that we then tried.
Richard Immerman. I was Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analytic Integrity and Standards and the Ombudsman for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The Office of Director of National Intelligence evolved. The whole thing basically came out of 9/11, but also the 9/11 report and then several of the Senate reports afterward. We all know the verbiage, that they didn't connect the dots, that they didn't share their information, all of the different issues. So after initial resistance from the Bush administration, the legislation was passed. The Office of the Director of National Intelligence was created. But for all intents and purposes, what that meant is a Director of National Intelligence was appointed. The legislation itself was very skeletal as to what it was going to do and how it was going to do whatever it did.
John Keefe again.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, 9/11 solved the funding problem pretty quickly, and then it was off to the races for hiring, and National Counterterrorism Center, that became a locus for CT analysts. Of course, CIA and NSA maintained their own cadres of counterterrorism analysts. But yes, I mean, as all these new folks were coming in, you had to facilitate their ability. You had to do two things: facilitate their ability to find each other, but also then you had to create some mechanism for allowing them to collaborate.
Right.
And so that was what did Mike Wertheimer call it? Was it iSpace or A-Space, Analytic Space?
Right. It was eventually called iSpace, but yes, A-Space.
Yes, and then the Library of National Intelligence. So that was, giving me an ability to look up past products that the intel community has produced, and then give me a platform where I can share information among analysts as I'm developing a finished product.
Jeffrey Fowler, chief of the wire. First of all, Tom Ridge is a prince. He was a wonderful man, sort of the right person in the right place in the right time, serving as Homeland Security advisor, and then, of course, the first secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. I had a chance to work very closely with him in the startup of that organization. I was there in some of the early consultations for the establishment of the DNI and the IRTPA. We did a very early version of what ultimately became TTIC. It was designed as a sort of a situation room, but focused on counterterrorism sorts of issues. So again, there was sort of the combination of sort of bureaucracy, which is to say, well, geez, how do we organize against this particular task, and also the sort of the moment, and there was sort of a recognition of the need to actually accomplish things.
I'm Tom Finger. I was the Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis and concurrently Chair of the National Intelligence Council. There's a separate stream of developments that Crawford resigned. A mix of health and unhappiness with the administration's decision to go to war in Iraq on there. But he resigned. The president nominated me to be the successor to it. And as a part of my confirmation hearings, Lugar mentioned that there had been calls for creating a director of national intelligence, and what did I think about it? And I said, I don't think we need one. So the current DCI does not have authority that he needs to run the community. I don't think we need another level. I don't need another boss. If approved here to be the assistant, I'd been assistant secretary under Clinton. So it was me, Ford, Finger again in terms of the assistant secretaries. That so to the extent I was on the record and had thought about it, it was sort of, we don't need more layers and more bosses in here, but we do need clearer authority to run the community. That as it unfolded, and it's moved pretty fast. After the issuance of the 9/11 report, which memory was that's like June or July, Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton very, very shrewdly making this a part of the campaign debates leading up, bringing in the families of the 9/11 victims to give it a higher profile. They played the politics of this superbly. The first response of the Bush team was, we don't want this. We don't need it. In many ways, it was a refined version, elaborate of my response to Lugar here. And I was part of, I don't know if it was heads or deputy heads of the agency components that were convened by the lawyer, John, I'm blanking on his last name, NSC lawyer for intelligence stuff, good guy, to come basically put together the argument that we didn't need this because we were already doing the things that were recommended in the commission, which was true. But after a few days of that, and the days we'd come together and talk in the morning. The lawyers would work on that, and maybe every other afternoon, the principals from the committee would go and move it along. I was doing both meetings. I guess it was handled at a deputies committee level. And Rich Armitage called me and said, "You go." I said, "It's kind of weird, Rich. You want to go in the afternoon and vote on what I worked on in the morning?" He said, "You want to be a big shot, you can go to these lousy meetings." So I did. And that seemed to be going along, but the hill is moving. There's going to be legislation. So it then became, how do we write the legislation in it? So the same group in the same basic process is now tweaking and writing what became the IRPA legislation. I go through all of that background because this forced me to actually think about the issues, the structures, the integration of what needed to be separate. And I started out, I think like everybody did, playing defense, right? How do we make sure that whatever comes out of this is not detrimental to the ability of my component, INR, to support diplomacy on here? And the other agencies were doing the same thing. There was a raft of components that really didn't affect us, law enforcement stuff. Some of the collection side things so that made me available to be recruited by others. And Steve Cambone was the one who expended the most effort to get. He said, "You don't care. Support me on this." And I said, "I understand that, Steve. What do I get for supporting Rummy out of this?" That kind of conversation took place. Some of it, admittedly facetious. Others that, I got to think about this. How would that affect Chief of Mission Authority? The special character of diplomatic reporting. Everybody likes diplomatic reporting better than almost any other kind of intelligence because you know exactly what you've got. Usually a named person wanted the United States government to have this information or to think that you know what you've got and you can go back easily.
Michael Wertheimer, Assistant Deputy Director and Chief Technology Officer for Analysis at the Office of the DNI. Tom is at DNI for a very, very specific reason. Right. He was the only one in the community that didn't buy in to the Rocky weapons of mass destruction. And he was the only one within the IC that said, no, this is wrong. And of course, who was the first DNI? His boss, Negroponte. So Negroponte said, I want the guy who got it right, and I want somewhat of an iconoclast willing to stand up to the community.
Now we hear again from Tom Fingar.
The role is we sat down in a coffee shop in the old executive office building there because the office that they had was so tiny that pulled out a piece of paper with the org chart. He said, this is what we think we're going to structure. And it had DNI, PDNI, and 4 boxes because the legislation allowed for 4 deputies. And said, well, one's going to be collection because I got a lot of stuff. One's going to be analysis. One's got to be management because of the responsibilities. And we've got this catch-all thing, which I think was called community outcomes or something. And I said, what the hell is that? He said, we're still figuring that out. It's going to be the catch-all for it. That we'd like you to take the analytic box. I think the first time I told him I'd think about it. And that wasn't anything other than I wanted to think about it. But what I wanted to think about was, what the hell would go in that box? How would I build a team? Then how would I build a totally new organization within a totally new organization? How do I recruit people when I don't know what the hell the positions are? How do I assign portfolios of responsibility when I don't know who the people are? So I wanted to think about what would I do? And to your question of was it daunting, was I afraid of what I had taken on? Not just arrogance on my part, but I'd actually thought about it a little bit. And I don't know, the day or two later when I went to see Negroponte, and he thanked me for agreeing to do this. He pointed at his whiteboard and had the same, that chart was up on the whiteboard. And he pointed at the box for analysis and said, you have 16 agencies, 20,000 people, and $50 billion. What are you going to do? I said, I'll get back to you, boss.
You have been listening to the podcast series From Tragedy to Transformation, Intelligence Reform After 9/11, sponsored by the Unredacted Podcast. The interviews you heard were conducted by me, Brian Drake. We would like to thank our many contributors to this series: Don Burke, Sean Dennehy, Margaret Dillard, Tom Fingar, Jeff Fowler, Nicole Gibson, Richard Immerman, John Keith, Mark Lowenthal, Rebecca McGregor, Joan McIntyre, Carmen Medina, Louis Shepard, Teresa Smetzer, Mike Wertheimer, Sean Woltman, and Jesse Wilson. From Tragedy to Transformation was produced by Lindy Kaiser and Brian Drake with support from Sean Dennehy, Jim Clapper, and Chris Rasmussen. If you have any questions or comments about this series, please reach out to us at questions@unredactedpodcast.com. And thank you.